Okay, today is Wednesday, 20th November. I'm still, as you can see, in Budapest. I did earlier today a program with my friend Patrick Henningsen, which you will see on this channel. The first program in which a guest has joined me on this channel. But the days are very full. There's very, very little time to do programs. I'm doing this program late in the evening. I'd like to take this opportunity to apologize to the community on locals for the fact that I was not able to do my usual live stream on locals this afternoon. There simply wasn't the time for that. And also, by the way, to thank Zarael, who I understand did a live stream in my place, which I shall be watching with interest over the next few hours. Tomorrow, as I understand it, is going to be an even busier day than today and yesterday have been. So, as I said, it's proving anyway, a challenge to do programs. And of course, there's also the issue of the fact that the lighting conditions in these programs, when making these programs, is very far from optimal. So altogether, apologies for the lighting conditions of these programs, the fact that they are relatively, significantly shorter than my usual programs. But anyway, I do what I can. Now, let me get straight away to the topic of my program today, and it continues with the continued, almost frenetic, feverish escalation which we're seeing from the Biden administration in the conflict in Ukraine in the last 10 weeks of its existence. Yesterday, we had the first missile strike with ATACMS missiles in Bryansk region. That attack appears to have been entirely unsuccessful. Today, we had a huge strike with up to 12 Storm Shadow missiles. These are missiles obviously launched from aircraft. They're British missiles. It's the biggest Storm Shadow strike that has taken place in the conflict in Ukraine for many months. It's obvious that there's been a stockpiling of these missiles precisely for this attack. The Russians have not yet provided an official account of this attack. Perhaps it would be best to wait until that official account appears before discussing it in detail. But we can say a few things. Firstly, the attack, this strike, appears to have been made targeting a specific village in Kursk region. Up to 10 Storm Shadow missiles were seen or filmed heading towards this one village. What exactly there is in this village, and I've seen pictures, it looks a very quiet village. What exactly there was in this village, in this one village, that justified an attack on this scale, it's not obvious to me. It's difficult for me to understand. There are some reports appearing on the Russian side of the internet that all 12 of the Storm Shadow missiles were shot down. That has been contradicted by other reports. There is a film which the Ukrainians themselves have released, which appears to show the Storm Shadows heading for this village and being observed by a Ukrainian drone. Very difficult for me to make much sense of this film, by the way. But anyway, I think that we will have to wait and see what the Russians say. As I said, reports on the Russian side of the internet say that all the missiles, all 12 of the Storm Shadows were shot down. Others appear to confirm that some, at least, of these Storm Shadows got through. Regardless, it is generally acknowledged that the stockpile of Storm Shadows is relatively small. I'm talking about the British stockpile, and is reducing. Apparently, Storm Shadows are still made in England, in Britain, but apparently this is a job that is largely done by hand, and production of Storm Shadows is small. So, using 12 missiles, 12 of these missiles, to conduct one strike, to me looks like overkill. And as I've said already, it's not at all clear to me what the objective, what the target of this attack in this one small village was. I have seen it suggested that this was again another demonstration attack, that it was all done basically for show, that the British and the Americans are aware that if the missiles were launched against some specific, well-defended Russian target, most of them would be shot down. That, after all, has been what has been happening in other areas of the battlefronts. So this village was chosen, possibly at random, to conduct an attack against it, in the knowledge that it was not heavily defended and that some or most or perhaps all of the missiles would get through. Now, I'm not saying that is true, by the way. It's just that I've seen some claims to that effect. Let's wait and see, as I said, what the Russians say about this particular episode, and then we can start to draw some further conclusions. All I will say is the Storm Shadows have been launched. They are, in theory, British missiles made in Britain with some technology that the British have themselves developed, but based on a French missile apparently designed and first put into production in the 1980s, which was then upgraded and continues in production in Britain and France. France, for the record, also has supplied Scalp missiles, which is the French analogue of the Storm Shadow, to Ukraine. So far, we've not had reports of these missiles being launched. There are claims that there are only 10 of these Scalp missiles supplied by France in Ukraine's possession, and that France is only supplying 40 of these missiles in total. There's also claims that the total number of ATACMS missiles in Ukraine's possession numbers no more than 50. I think after all the massive amount of misinformation and misdirection we have received over the last few weeks on this whole topic of missiles to Ukraine and how they would be used, I discussed all of this in my program yesterday. I think we can take all of these claims about the very limited numbers of these missiles with a mountain of salt. All I would say is, putting all that aside, the total number of these missiles is limited. And the British, the French, the Americans as well, cannot continue to launch missiles at this current pace. And if the Germans join in with their Taurus missiles, they too will run out of missiles they can use in a relatively short time, in a matter of weeks at most, if the present tempo of operations, of strikes, is maintained. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss this missile strike further. As I said, presumably we will get more news from the Russians soon. But of course, the key point to say about the Storm Shadow missiles is that, as President Putin himself said, these missiles, these Storm Shadow missiles, can only be launched if they have been programmed and prepared by Western technicians. And there have been articles in the British media which makes it clear that the targeting data and the information and the terrain following systems used by these Storm Shadow missiles are proprietary technologies of the United States and that these missiles cannot be used without direct, active American involvement. So, this strike with Storm Shadow missiles on positions in Russia, an area where we know GPS signals are heavily jammed, so that these terrain guidance modes would have to be used for these sort of missiles. This latest attack can only have happened with the active involvement of the United States. And that, in turn, would have had to be authorized by the Biden administration. But this is not the last act of escalation from the Biden administration that we have seen over the last 24 hours, because the Biden administration has also now authorized supply to Ukraine of anti-personnel mines. Now, the thing to say about this is that there is a convention, the Ottawa Convention, which seeks to prohibit the use of anti-personnel mines. And this convention has been signed and ratified by 160 countries. I understand that Russia and the United States are not amongst these countries, though incidentally, I also understand that Ukraine itself is. Ukraine obviously is not bothered by that. They're not worried about the fact that they're using anti-personnel mines of a type prohibited by an international convention that they have signed, if that is actually the case, as I believe it is. But the United States, well, it has not apparently signed or ratified this convention, but they have indicated at various times that they were minded to do so. And the president himself, Joe Biden, has apparently campaigned in the past on platforms seeking the prohibition of these types of mines. Well, unsurprisingly, to those who've followed his behaviour and that of his administration over the course of this conflict, these inhibitions, these concerns have all fallen away. The overriding priority again remains to give to Ukraine every piece of assistance that it can be provided. So there we are. These anti-personnel mines are being supplied to Ukraine also. The administration is justifying this decision by claiming that the Russian army is advancing in Ukraine, which it certainly is, by the way, and it is doing so through the use essentially of wave tactics, human wave tactics, large forces thrown into battle, indifferent to losses, things of that sort. I've discussed this in program after program on this channel and on the Duran itself. There is not a scintilla of evidence that the Russians have used human wave tactics at any point in the war. There is not a single video that I have seen which shows them doing so. And if one follows the various reports that have been appearing in the media over the last couple of weeks, I'm speaking now principally of the US media, they tell a completely different story, that in their latest advances, the Russians conduct themselves completely differently. They use infiltration tactics, they attack with small groups of men, they exploit whatever advantage they achieve, and their advances are always carefully prepared with air strikes and shelling and mortar attacks and use of TOS, thermobaric multiple launch rocket systems, and that kind of thing. So this justification for the supply to Ukraine of anti-personnel mines contradicts Western accounts of what actually has been happening on the Ukrainian battlefields. In fact, and in reality, we see more and more of the contradictions piling up. So, by way of example, we have heard almost nothing over the last 24 hours about the North Korean troops, about whom so much was being said for so many weeks, and who were cited as the justification for the decision to authorize the missile strikes. Now, over the course of various discussions I have had with him over the course of today here in Budapest, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has made what I think actually, looking back, may be the correct point, that this whole story about the North Korean troops was clearly coordinated with the Ukrainians, and the fact that the story appeared at all was clearly intended to justify the supply of missiles and the use of these missiles in deep strikes against Russia, and that it points to a decision to launch these missiles, which must have been taken several weeks ago, sometime significantly before the US presidential election. And I would add that the Storm Shadow story, the attack with the Storm Shadows, suggests the same thing, that the decision to conduct this strike with Storm Shadows, given the fact that these missiles presumably are using this proprietary American technology, all of that also points to a decision to prepare for this strike, to stockpile the missiles, to conduct this strike several weeks ago, or almost certainly before the US election. Nonetheless, the objective, as I said, remains the same: to embarrass Donald Trump if he became president, and to box in Kamala Harris if she had been elected president instead of Trump. Harris could not have gone back on a policy decision made by Biden, the president of the administration of which she was a part. And of course, Trump can do so, but it would be very difficult for him to do that. I will return to Donald Trump and his options and the various rumors and theories that are circulating, and in particular, a report that has appeared in Reuters in a moment. But anyway, in the meantime, the Western powers, who have been confidently telling us that all the warnings from Russia about the use of these missiles were a bluff, are now telling a completely different thing. Over the course of the last 24 hours, they have been busy closing their embassies in Kiev, telling everybody, all their citizens, to leave Kiev. Some have gone further still, apparently, and have said that their citizens should leave Ukraine as a whole. There have been rumors and theories and claims and speculations about a massive Russian missile strike on Kiev being about to happen. The suggestion was that the Russians would be targeting embassy buildings and doing something of that kind. And anyway, the Western governments, as I said, having told us for days, weeks, months that there was nothing to fear from the Russians if these fateful decisions which have been taken were taken, are now telling us something completely different. I have to say that the moment I heard all those reports about the embassies closing right across Kiev, it seemed to me again that we were looking at a story of misdirection. Because if there are buildings in Kiev which the Russians are extremely unlikely to attack, it is Western embassies. We are talking about the Russians. Some countries do conduct attacks on embassies, on consulates. To give an example, Israel, back in April, conducted an airstrike on an Iranian embassy building, apparently an embassy building that houses the Iranian consulate in Damascus. I've never heard of the Russians ever doing such a thing. They didn't do it, as far as I know, at any point during the Second World War. They never attacked any German embassy, for example, in any third country. I've never heard of it ever being done during the entire Tsarist era. And I cannot imagine that the Russians would do a thing like that this time. After all, doing so would be a gross violation of international law. And I can hardly imagine that the Russians would see any value in doing such a thing at this time when, as I discussed in my program yesterday, following the outcome of the G20 summit, they must feel that the diplomatic battle is continuing to run heavily in their favour. I would add that over the last 24 hours, the Kremlin has published information that President Putin himself has received an invitation to travel to India from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The various attempts by the Western powers to cause trouble between India and Russia have clearly failed. The Indians, having dipped their toe in mediation between the Russians and the Ukrainians, we saw that with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Kiev some weeks ago, and realizing that the Ukrainians are unable and incapable of conducting negotiations. Anyway, the Indians appear to have dropped that idea, and they're now straightforwardly and simply inviting Vladimir Putin to visit India and to have a meeting with the Indian leadership there. Now, the Russians are most unlikely to want to put diplomatic meetings of that kind, foreign policy meetings of that kind, in jeopardy by taking the extraordinary step of attacking Western embassies, which they know would horrify most governments. So I didn't believe this story, and surprise, surprise, there has been no Russian missile strike on Kiev. None of the things that many people were talking about has actually happened, and some Russian officials are even going around saying that not only was this story absurd, but it reflects again Western cowardice, that the Western powers are like worms hiding in their holes. The reality is that when the Russians do act, when they do strike, they will do so in a way that is unexpected and unannounced. Now, there is again a lot of speculation about what the Russians are going to do. There's a long article today in The Guardian about the Russians engaging in a sabotage program over the next couple of weeks, that they're going to continue the covert war. I discussed all of this in my program yesterday. Quite possibly they will. I'm not saying that they won't. The Russians have, however, said that whatever it is that they do decide to do, it will be public and visible, and they will assume responsibility for it. They want to demonstrate that they will enforce their red lines. Now, the Iranians said exactly the same after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. There were many claims and reports that the Iranian comments were a bluff. The weeks passed and there was no Iranian strike on Israel. The weeks turned into months, and many people were going around saying that Iran was a paper tiger. The Israelis embarked on further escalation, and on the 1st of October, the Iranians did finally launch their strike, and it proved devastating. 36 missiles penetrated the Nevatim air base in the Negev desert, doing, from the satellite photos, significant damage. And, well, there were other attacks, other targets struck in various parts of Israel as well. So we must assume that because the Russians haven't rushed to launch missile strikes or do other even more extreme things in the last few hours, that they are not going to do so. On the contrary, the pattern of Russian responses is that they bide their time, they assess the situation, they wait and pick the moment when their response is going to be the most effective. And the fact that Vladimir Putin himself has made himself invisible over the last couple of hours, that he's allowed comments instead to be made by his officials, Lavrov, Medvedev, Volodin, and others, is not a sign of reassurance. It is, as I've often pointed out, an ominous sign. When Putin tends to disappear, when he no longer makes himself visible, almost certainly it implies that he is in deep discussions with his senior officials, and usually action of some kind eventually follows. I remember, for example, that after the Maidan events of February 2014, after, in other words, the events which in February 2014 led to the fall of Ukraine's former president, Viktor Yanukovych, Putin disappeared for about 2 weeks. And then suddenly he resurfaced, and by that point, the Crimean operation, the one which brought Crimea under Russian control, was well underway. So it's not impossible that we could see something similar happen this time. Anyway, let's move on and discuss an article which has appeared in Reuters, based supposedly on information given to Reuters by 5 former Russian officials. Now, this article tells us that Putin himself is open to ideas about freezing the conflict, possibly on the existing conflict lines. He is going to insist, however, on firm guarantees that Ukraine never enters NATO, and he has also supposedly left open the possibility of Ukraine being provided with alternative security guarantees. There is no reason to take this story at all seriously. Now, the first thing to say is that Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has straightforwardly denied it. He has said that Russia is not interested in a freeze. And this I'm taking from TASS, commenting on a Reuters report that there are several scenarios for ending the conflict. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said, "No scenario of freezing the conflict will suit us. It is important for us to achieve our goals, which are well known to everyone." Almost certainly, this latest report, which has appeared in Reuters, is yet another example of these reports that appear from time to time, which appear to be sourced to Russian sources, but which have no real connection to them. We've had other reports, as I remember, a couple of months ago, also discussing possible scenarios for peace talks, which never materialized. We've had a relatively recent article in the Financial Times talking about discussions allegedly underway between Ukraine and Russia for a mutual cessation of the energy war, the attacks on each other's energy systems. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians said those reports were untrue, and I frankly believe this report from Reuters is untrue as well. I do not believe that Russian officials would share this information, would provide this information to Reuters. A couple of weeks ago, connected with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, there were all sorts of articles which appeared that time in the Daily Telegraph, allegedly based on interviews with unnamed Iranian officials, which provided all sorts of details or apparent details about the circumstances of Ismail Haniyeh's assassination and of the actions and behavior and ideas of President Pezeshkian of Iran. And I said that not only did the stories seem to me unlikely to be true, but I thought it inconceivable that senior officials of the Iranian government would be sharing this sort of information with the Daily Telegraph. And I have since been told by people like Professor Syed Marandi and Alistair Crook, who are much more informed about things in Tehran than I, of course, am, that assessment that I made, that the Daily Telegraph stories could not be true, was correct, and I'm confident about this Reuters story as well. There is a huge misinformation exercise underway, again intended in some way to shape the actions of the future Trump administration. So we have a situation where we have missile strikes, we have more and more weapons being sent to Ukraine, we've had all sorts of attempts to try to escalate the war, to provoke the Russians into strong, provocative actions which the West could turn to its advantage. But looming behind everything, there continues to be the question of Donald Trump and of what he intends to do. I'm going to express here my own personal belief. From what I can tell, up to now, these missile strikes are having only very limited effect, if they're having any effect at all. The Russians can clearly see that the purpose of these attacks is to create problems between Putin and Donald Trump ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration. They are winning the war in Ukraine and winning it decisively. We will come to that in a moment. And Donald Trump has given indications that he wants to wind the war down. There are reports that Trump is close to appointing a peace envoy to contact the Russians and the Ukrainians. The individual in question, whose name, by the way, I'm not sure how to pronounce, so I'm not going to try to, is somebody who has worked for Donald Trump as a lawyer. He has no background in international diplomacy. He has no background in the State Department, but he was born in the Soviet Union and he speaks Russian. And this person apparently is keen to be appointed to this role. The point about him is that he is, like all the other appointments we have discussed on various programs, both on this channel and on the Duran, that he is completely loyal to Donald Trump. I think the Russians will welcome an envoy of this kind, someone who comes from outside the neocon-dominated State Department. Just saying. Notice that the appointment of this person appears to cut Marco Rubio, the future Secretary of State, completely out of the discussions about the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. So the Russians probably still waiting to see what Donald Trump is going to do. But these rumors that this envoy is going to be appointed is something that they will probably see as a positive sign. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that the Russians are putting all their bets on Donald Trump in this war. As we've seen, Peskov has gone out of his way to make clear that the Russians are not interested in freezing the conflict, that they're going to proceed on the basis recently set out by Putin, which I discussed in a recent program, on the basis that the 4 regions should be recognized as their territory, that Crimea should also be recognized, at least de facto, as their territory, that the Ukrainians pull completely out of the four regions and cease their attacks on Crimea, and that they negotiate in all other respects, taking as a starting point the concessions they made in Istanbul. I don't myself believe that the Russians are going to want to retreat from this position to any significant degree, but they probably calculate that Donald Trump is going to feel that agreeing to these terms does not contradict American national interests. At least that is what they hope. They will continue the war. They're not going to slacken their effort to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. They're not investing too many hopes in Donald Trump. But if they're right, some kind of larger understanding between the Americans and the Russians is possible. And it will obviously touch on the situation in Europe, but it will also deal with this issue of Ukraine. In the meantime, the Russians are continuing the war. And here, I'm just going to mention a truly astonishing comment that Zelensky himself has made. He has stated that Ukraine does not have the military resources to capture or recapture Crimea by force of arms, that expecting that Ukraine can achieve its 1991 borders by military means is unrealistic, but that Ukraine still wants to achieve that objective, though he doesn't fully explain how. He also, by the way, says that even if Donald Trump cuts off all military aid to Ukraine, the Ukrainians will continue fighting. It's a mass of contradictions, but it is the closest Ukraine has ever come, rather Zelensky has ever come, to admitting that a military victory is now beyond Ukraine's reach. But entirely predictably, he does not follow his own logic. He does not say that since that kind of military victory is impossible, then the only sensible and logical thing for Ukraine to do is to seek some kind of end to hostilities, basically on the lines I've been talking about. This despite the fact that, as has been pointed out to me in a private email, polling in Ukraine shows that an absolute majority of Ukrainians now want an early negotiated ending of the war. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have been publishing, this is, I believe, in the Kiev Independent, a fascinating account about the Battle of Krynky. The Battle of Krynky began, as I remember, in October 2023. 4 Marine brigades of the Ukrainian Armed Forces participated. It was a landing operation on the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. It rapidly degenerated into an attrition battle. The Krynky bridgehead was rapidly isolated by the Russians. The Ukrainians, as they always do, persisted in reinforcing it. More and more men were sent to try and hold Krynky. Bitter articles started to appear, especially in the American media, but also the Ukrainian media, discussing the anger and disillusion of the Ukrainian soldiers sent to fight in Krynky and the terrible conditions under which they had to fight. And eventually, the whole operation collapsed. The Ukrainians were driven out at the bridgehead, and the Russians obtained complete control. Well, the Ukrainian media now tells us what, by the way, I previously guessed, and which had been the topic of one of my videos, which is that the entire scheme for the Krynky operation was cooked up in London. That the whole idea was British, that the British apparently played a central role in training the various Ukrainian Marine brigades to conduct this operation, that they played some role in sorting out and preparing the overall plans. General Zaluzhny, the then commander of the Ukrainian military, apparently had his doubts about the whole operation. This article in the Ukrainian media claims that Zelensky did as well, though I hardly believe that. And the Krynky operation, as it turns out, was not just intended to capture a small strip of territory, a few kilometers square on the east bank of the Dnieper. It was indeed intended as a second prong of Ukraine's 2023 offensive. It was intended to lead to a breakthrough all the way to the Black Sea, unblocking the port of Nikolaev on the Dnieper, I believe it's on the Dnieper itself, or it might be the Dniester, I'm not sure. But anyway, unblocking Nikolaev and isolating Crimea itself, leading to the ultimate and eventual defeat of the Russians. And I pointed out, I'm sure I remember pointing out, that the British military officer who seemed at that time to be in overall charge of supporting the Ukrainians and was giving all kinds of guidance to the Ukrainians is Admiral Radakin, who is, of course, a British naval officer. And perhaps it's not surprising that a British naval officer, who I believe also, by the way, played a central role in organising the missile strikes on Russian warships in the Black Sea, that a naval officer also came up with this harebrained scheme for an amphibious operation on the east bank of the Dnieper. As the article says, the whole operation was a complete disaster. The logistics were never sorted out. The whole plan proved far too ambitious. The Russians, this is a part of the art, an aspect of what happened, which this article doesn't really want to touch on. The Russians proved far too well organized and reacted far too quickly in overwhelming force. And the whole operation failed almost immediately. It turned into an effective disaster. Those who are familiar with the Second World War will be familiar with an operation that the Allies conducted in the area of Naples in 1943, in the area of Rome rather, in 1943, the so-called Battle of Anzio, when a British and American expeditionary force landed near the town of Anzio, close to Rome, and they got bottled up by the Germans. And even to this day, this operation is widely seen as a debacle. Well, this particular debacle, the Krynky debacle, looks somewhat similar, except, of course, that in this case, the Ukrainians eventually had to abandon the bridgehead, whereas in the Second World War, the Allies never abandoned the Anzio bridgehead. Anyway, put all that aside, the whole battle of Krynky was a disaster. But what it shows, again, is the incredibly bad advice that the Ukrainians are given by their erstwhile allies, and the extent to which the allies, their erstwhile allies, constantly prod them into more and more aggressive actions. The British are obsessed with Russia and are determined to defeat Russia in some way in Ukraine. They pushed the Ukrainians into this operation in Krynky against the better judgment of Ukraine's own senior commanders, and it ended in disaster. Unsurprisingly, I have found no reference to this article anywhere in the British media today. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. I'm going to quickly now turn to the situation on the battlefronts because things are moving very fast. It looks as if the Russians, having crossed from Novaya Ilinka across the bridge, have captured much of central Kurachovo. My sense is that Kurachovo itself is about to fall. There are reports that the Russians have also captured the central areas of Toretsk, and Toretsk is about to fall as well. Further reports earlier today spoke of the Russians having now captured some of the industrial buildings in the industrial area of Chasiv Yar. If that is the case, then Chasiv Yar also is about to fall. And there are reports of other Russian advances in other places. I've not been able to keep on top of all of this information, but the information that is trickling out suggests that the Russian offensive continues unabated. We are so focused on these missile attacks. We're so focused on what action the Russians might take in response to this that we risk missing the bigger picture, which is that the underlying war continues and continues in the same way as before, with further Russian advances and more Ukrainian defeats. The Krynky affair demonstrates the bad advice that the Ukrainians get from their friends. And in fact, the way in which their so-called friends push the Ukrainians into calamitous actions. I'm going to suggest that this business with the missile strikes is another example. The Ukrainians have perhaps obtained a brief morale boost from this. It's not making any actual difference on the battlefronts. As we will see, the morale boost will fade away. The grind in Ukraine will continue, and the missile strikes will change nothing in that respect, except, of course, that they will make Ukraine's position still more difficult in diplomatic negotiations, as I discussed yesterday, and it will further poison relations between the Russians and the West. Well, there it is. That's where we are today. The British, unsurprisingly, following their master's lead, the monkey dancing to the tune of the organ grinder. I hate talking about my own country in that way, but I can't resist doing so. Why the British government would want to do a thing like this just 8 or 10 weeks before the new president takes office, apparently with completely different ideas to the present one, I can't even begin to understand. All it's going to do is going to further annoy and antagonize him, and he's already angry with the British, or at least with the British government, because it sent teams of advisors and people to help Kamala Harris, his opponent in the election, and that can't have pleased Donald Trump. So anyway, we seem to be intent on making our relations with the new administration even worse than they already are, and we're doing so in a way that is not going to change the outcome of the war. I find this all extremely difficult to understand. I wonder who is giving advice to British ministers and why British ministers should follow this obviously bad advice if that is what they're being given. But anyway, there it is. We remain as obsessed as always. We have to, in Britain, continue to act in a way that provokes Russia, an immeasurably more powerful country than ourselves. And the objectives that we are following remain utterly mysterious to me. The objectives, mysterious, but the bad consequences, by contrast, well, those are certain. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. I'm not sure when and how I'll be able to make my program tomorrow. I will do my best. If I cannot, my apologies in advance. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.